everyone, welcome to Knitting Noodles, and in today's video we are going to do our first following a pattern, written pattern project. And this also incorporates stockinette stitch, which I did a previous video on. The link will be up there on the little card that comes down if you want to watch this, which I highly recommend before starting this. And now this is a perfect opportunity also to go over how to read a pattern. So two birds, one stone. All right, so let's get into our pattern. All right, let's take a look at this Scrunchie pattern by Tina Vandenberg. I found this on Ravelry.com. It is a free Ravelry download. First thing we want to look at is our materials. So this is in weights, so 180 to 240 per 50 grams. You'll find that on the little label on the back, or it's just a weight 1 yarn. So sock weight yarn. That's what I used, and it worked out perfectly fine. You need a hair tie. I just used like a regular old hair tie that you have. It says in here, just recommends not to do one with a metal connector. We got the needle size, which is a 3.5 millimeter, which is a US 4. You can do circular needles. I don't have that size circular needle, so I used the flat, which luckily she includes a version of the pattern for that as well. You only need stitch markers if you're knitting in the round, and you need a wool needle, which is another way to say yarn needle. Now, what you really need to do is pay attention to the knitting gauge, which this is a 10 by 10 centimeter. We always do our knitting gauge before we start knitting, because this determines whether it is the right size or not. So these are the instructions how to do our knitting gauge. And I ended up shortening this, doing half and half to get a smaller square because I didn't want to knit that much. But for this pattern in particular, it's not as important. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is do our gauge swatch, which I showed you before in the online version. It says to do a 10 by 10 centimeter gauge. I am going to shorten that because I don't have a lot of patience. So I'm going to change it to a 5 by 5, which I would do by cutting the number of stitches in half. Now, I don't know if this is accurate, but it's the lazy way to do it. So that is the way that I'm going to do it. Anyway, let's get into this. So it says to do 26. It says to do 26. I'm going to cut that in half and do 13, 38, 19. Alright, so I'm going to do 13 by 19 instead. Got a little sheet of paper. And whoop, cue the time lapse. Now quickly, I forgot to mention, this pattern does say in the gauge that it is not that important to do a gauge swatch, because for your scrunchie, it's alright to have a little bit of variation. It's going to be bigger than the hair tie no matter what you use, but if you're using a chunkier yarn, you don't want it to be absolutely enormous. You want like a reasonable sized scrunchie. So you do want to do a gauge swatch just to make sure you don't have anything way too big. Way too small isn't really that big of an issue. The other thing I forgot to mention is that the gauge, as instructed by the pattern, is to be in stockinette stitch. So that means knit one row, purl the next row, knit and then purl. If you do garter stitch or a different type of stitch, then the gauge won't be representative of what the pattern itself will measure out to be at the end, which is what the gauge is for. It's to be able to estimate how big your project will be at the end and whether you have the right size needles, the right sized yarn. So yeah, back to the time lapse. Okay, so we finished the gauge swatch. This is supposed to be 5 centimeters. It is exactly 5 centimeters. Now for the top, I'm not going to include this row of bumps because I knit an extra row to cast off. So when we look at that, it is just over 5 centimeters, like 5.5. But honestly, it's not that big of a difference, so I am still gonna go ahead and consider this as the right sized gauge. It is such a tiny bit of difference that it doesn't impact the pattern a crazy amount. If it was more than a full centimeter, I would probably size down a needle. For these, sizing down a needle would affect too much, because I have the width, the perfect gauge, which is the main thing that matters when you're making a scrunchie. You want the length to be the right size. The height doesn't matter that much. For other things that might be more particular to size, that might matter a little bit more. But for this, I say it's okay, so it's okay. So now let's get into reading the pattern. Alright, now let's get into reading the instructions. As I said before, you always want to give a brief little look through to make sure that you know everything that's coming up. So you can see the first part of the pattern tells you how to do it if you're knitting in the round. However, a lot of beginners and a lot of more experienced people don't have all the size circular needles. And so I am very glad that she has a option that you can knit flat with regular needles. So for knitting flat, we want to cast on 102 stitches with needle size that we used for the gauge, the US 4, or 3.5 millimeters. Then the wrong side, we're going to knit one, purl until there's 1 stitch left, and then we're going to knit that one. Then the next row is the right side, where all stitches until the end of the row are knit, and then we're gonna keep going and doing this every other row until it measures 8 centimeters or 3.15 inches. Then we're gonna cast off, we're gonna seam the short sides together so it's a continuous circle. We're gonna put the scrunchie so it's facing the wrong side, so that's facing out, and then we're gonna sew up the edges. This is just so you don't have any surprises as you're going, and you don't get surprised like, oh no, it says I need to sew this up, I have to run out and get a yarn needle immediately right now. If you read it beforehand, you know if you need yarn while you're at the store to get a yarn needle as well. It just helps to read it ahead of time from experience. Alright, so let's get into knitting this. Okay, since this is a little bit of a longer piece, I am going to knit like this since I want to be comfortable while I'm knitting. And when I do it overhead, the overhead shot, this chair is kind of low, so I have to be on my knees. And for 102 cast on, I don't want to be on my knees for that long. So we're gonna relax, take it easy, have a nice time while we're knitting. Okay, so the first thing, as you saw before and I walked you through the pattern, always walk through beforehand before you start knitting. It just helps so there's no surprises that you find out as you're going, because that's happened to me, because your girl impatient as hell. And a lot of times I just want to get things started. So I just start without looking ahead and then go, oops, I'm supposed to have another color. Or, oops, I don't have this tool. What the heck am I supposed to use? So reading ahead is a very good idea. I don't know why I'm pointing so much with these. It's kind of fun. All right. So first thing we need to do is cast on 102 stitches if you're using the straight needles, which I am. You can follow along, or if you want to do the circular needle thing, go right ahead and have it. I don't have that size, so I'm not using it. So we're interpreting it into the flat one, which luckily she has written down, which is very lovely. Okay. So we're gonna get into casting on. In your preferred cast on method, neither of you had cast on. Up top, wait, I think that's, I might have the sides mixed up. I don't know. This side, one of the sides. There's gonna be a card. And you're gonna click that, and it's gonna take you to the cast on video, if you need it. If not, proceed. We are going to cast on 102 stitches in your preferred method. In my video, I only go over the two very basic cast on methods. There are more complicated versions. My personal favorite is the German long tail cast on, which I found in this, one of the sides, I think it's this side, this side here. Very in-depth video on how to cast on. I stopped on the German long tail, loved it, and haven't looked back. It makes such a clean edge. Anyway, I'm distracting myself. Back to cast on. I'm just putting it off. I don't want to cast on 102 stitches and count that. 102 stitches coming up. Okay, finally, I have 102 stitches on this thing. So the next thing we're going to do is the first and last stitches for this pattern are always going to be knit, whether it's a knit side or a purl side. So the first side is actually going to be a wrong side, so we're going to start with purling. I'm going to start off knitting one. Need to review how to knit, which if you're this far, if you're looking up projects to do, I doubt you need to know how to do your, I bet you already know how to do the knit stitch. If you need a review, however, here's my video right over there. And then we're gonna get into purling. Now, if you need to review how to purl, I also have a video on that, also up top. And so the rest, these 99 stitches, are going to be purl. I'll come back at the end of this purl row. Bye-bye. Hello, welcome to day 2. I have finally finished this. Let me take you down and we'll look at it. I know I kind of skipped to the end where I had it completely finished. Just remember that the knit side is just that, just all of them knit. There's nothing special about it. The only thing different is the purl row where you have to knit the first and last stitch. So let's get back to me going over this. Don't mind my spare change. Ha. Took me about a day and a half to reach. Let's see, side, is this on the right side? Yeah, it's metric. we're going for 8 centimeters, which we just perfectly reached. It's 8. It's a little difficult because this does, since stockinette stitch, it just wants to curl up. So you do have to you don't want to stretch it because then it'll be a not even measurement. So it's a fine line between pulling and just trying to flatten. So with that, we get about 8. It's going to add a little bit with the cast off, but I think it's close enough to call it 8. Alright, so let me cast this off and then we'll get into the next steps of the pattern. Okay, and now it's timely. Now it's finally time to finish this up. It says to leave a very long tail for seaming up. I'm gonna use this tail to seam up the sides, so I want a very long tail for this. That's probably good enough. I still have some left. Back in my scrap. And then I cast off all the stitches. So I'm just gonna take the end of the very long tail that I left and pass it through here. Alright, so there's one last step if you did decide to use circular needles, but if you used, like me, straight needles, we have to sew these sides together so it makes a continuous loop. So it will come back with this all sewn together. Okay, so I seamed the sides together, so now it's one continuous loop. Now the next thing we have to do is to make sure the knit side is out, so the V's. That is going to be out, and we are going to start sewing these edges together. Now, as you can see, it's a little difficult because of the curl that stockinette stitch has. So one thing the pattern does recommend is to block your pattern. Now, what blocking means, I think I'm going to do it just because it's so curled. Originally, I wasn't going to, but I think I'm going to block it. So what blocking means is that you get your piece wet so that it lays flat. That's all that blocking means, and then you let it dry. And doing this does correct a lot of small issues that you might have with pattern, like laying flat, or if certain stitches are too big, blocking can actually even all of that out over leaving it to dry flat and shaping it a little bit while it's wet. So I have a little spray bottle. I usually keep this in my room with a little bit of essential oils in there, just to spritz around, but that's not really damaging for wool. I'm using alpaca, so essential oils, it won't do anything bad to it. It just will smell a little nice. So I'm just gonna spritz this all over. It's probably gonna take longer because I'm spritzing instead of dunking. It's flat enough. I'm gonna work with it while it's wet. You could alternatively let it dry, and you would kind of like put a weight on it like a book, or some people pin the corners down so it dries in the shape that you want, so it'll stay that way. I'm fine with a little bit of curl. I'll just work around it. I got my whole desk wet. Alright, so what we do for seaming it up, I have my hair tie. We're going to make sure that that's on the inside. We're going to fold this over. Gonna put it in the middle. So make sure that the hair tie is on the purl side. So purl side is where the hair tie goes, so that the knit side will be on the outside. So let's find where our yarn starts, which is right here. Let me pull that through. And now the edge is going to be seamed up with blanket stitch. Now this is a specific type of stitch, usually used for trimming, called blanket stitch, I believe, because it is usually used on, like, I don't know about historically, but I usually see it on the edges of like fleece blankets. I will link a video up there to a good, more in detail instruction video on how to do blanket stitch. I'll do it quickly for you, just so you can get the general idea, but if you're not understanding it, definitely click that link so you can see a more in detail video. So basically, what we're gonna do is we're gonna go through the other side. I think I'm gonna do 2 of these, and all you do is, instead of pulling it all the way through, is you bring it back through the loop. I have a very long piece of string, so it makes it a little harder. So it doesn't really look like anything for that first stitch, but as you go on, you will see it becomes like a decorative border stitch. So let's see, this is the next one. Again, you bring it around the needle. It's an easy way to do it at the beginning. It's gonna be difficult with natural fibers. All right, so you can kind of see here. Let me do a few more just to make it a little bit more clear. Oh, not in shot, not paying attention. Let's wrap it around again. I think 2 in a row, you can probably see. Yeah, you can see it now. All right, you can see the stitches on the side. See, it almost makes like a little, I don't know, a house shape. I don't know how to call that. But you can see the 2 lines, and then it makes a stitch along the top, which makes it a little decorative, a little nice. You could alternatively just like stitch it together if you want it more invisible. I just thought that this was a nice little touch to make a more decorative border for it. All right, so let me finish seaming up the side and we'll have a finished scrunchie. All right, here's the finished piece. Really cute border. I love how the blanket stitch turned out. I've been wearing this actually for the rest of the day, a few hours since I finished it. And it's a very nice scrunchie, and I like the material that I used. And I do really like the colors. And I am definitely going to be wearing this a lot. So I hope you guys enjoyed your scrunchie too, and have a nice rest of your day, and I'll see you all next week for another video. Bye!